Arlington, Virginia, 1946. A cryptanalyst sat in a windowless room, staring at rows of numbers that meant nothing to most people. 14-hour shifts, cold coffee, endless intercepted cables from across the world. The war was over, but something else had begun, something quieter and far more dangerous. Then one afternoon, buried deep in the static and noise, he saw a pattern, a code name, coordinates that should not exist. The cable itself looked ordinary, just another piece of traffic among thousands. But what it contained was evidence of a betrayal that would take decades to fully understand. While he worked to decode those numbers, somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, a physicist walked into a laboratory where scientists were splitting atoms and building weapons that could end civilization. Nobody in that room knew he was carrying secrets out with him, passing them to handlers who reported directly to Moscow. Soviet spies were not created by accident. They were built through careful selection, long-term planning, and an understanding of human psychology that Western intelligence agencies underestimated for far too long. Between the early 1930s and the final collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, hundreds of individuals betrayed their countries, their colleagues, and their oaths. They did it because someone convinced them it was the right thing to do, because they had access to rooms where history was being written, and because they believed their governments were on the wrong side of that history. They recruited university students who would become diplomats, scientists who would work on nuclear programs, civil servants who would spend decades inside intelligence agencies, except the desperate criminals or violent extremists. The whole operation was not about dramatic midnight exchanges or car chases through European streets. It actually shows patience, about planting someone in 1935 and waiting until 1955 for them to reach a position where they could actually do damage. Cambridge University, 1930s. Europe was tearing itself apart. Fascism was rising in Germany, Italy, Spain. Young men and women watched as democratic governments failed to stop it, watched as appeasement replaced resistance. Many of them turned to communism, because it was the only ideology that seemed willing to physically fight fascism other than some abstract political theory. Soviet intelligence officers knew exactly where to look. They did not knock on doors or make cold approaches. They attended the same meetings, the same lectures, the same student gatherings. A professor would linger after class, ask a bright student about his thoughts on the Spanish Civil War, gauge his reaction, his passion, his willingness to act. A colleague at a research facility would wonder aloud, almost casually, whether it was right for one country to control scientific discoveries that could change the balance of global power. These conversations were not random. They were interviews, carefully designed to identify individuals who had two critical qualities: strong ideological conviction and a trajectory that would lead them into positions of influence. The people who became Soviet spies convinced themselves they were not betraying anything. They believed they were serving a higher cause, that their actions would prevent another world war, that sharing atomic secrets or diplomatic cables was an act of moral courage rather than treason. This is what made them so effective and so difficult to catch. Do you think they were not nervous, guilty, or paranoid? But no. Actually, they were confident, even righteous. They looked their colleagues in the eye, attended the same dinner parties, married into the same social circles, and believed every moment of it was justified. If you are starting to see how this was something closer to a recruitment movement, a long-term ideological project, then you are beginning to understand why it worked for so long. The Soviets were cultivating assets the way you cultivate relationships, with time, attention, and an understanding of what motivates people at the deepest level, other than running smash-and-grab operations. And if you want to see how this played out in actual cases, how belief and access combined to create some of the most damaging intelligence breaches in history, then keep watching, because the next part shows you exactly how it happened. Hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next is where theory meets reality, and you will see just how close the world came to losing secrets it could never afford to lose. Klaus Fuchs looked like every other scientist working at Los Alamos in 1943. Quiet, focused, brilliant. Born in Germany, fled the Nazis, found refuge in Britain, and earned his way onto the Manhattan Project through sheer intellectual ability. He had security clearance. He had access to the most classified research happening anywhere on the planet. He sat in meetings where physicists discussed how to trigger a nuclear chain reaction, how to design a bomb that could level entire cities, and while he was doing that work, While he was contributing real scientific value to the Allied war effort, he was also meeting a Soviet handler in remote locations and handing over everything he knew. Technical drawings, mathematical calculations, design specifications for the plutonium implosion device that would become the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Fuchs did it because he believed, genuinely and completely, that allowing one country to monopolize atomic weapons would destabilize the entire post-war world. And he didn't hate America or Britain. He thought the Soviet Union needed the bomb to balance American power, and he thought his access gave him the moral responsibility to act rather than the opportunity. He passed secrets for years. Nobody suspected him. He was too quiet, too reliable, too committed to the work. The only reason he was eventually caught was because American and British cryptanalysts working on a program called Venona managed to decrypt Soviet intelligence cables sent during the war. Even then, it took years to connect a code name in those cables to Klaus Fuchs. Even then, they needed him to confess, which he did, calmly and without much emotion, as though he were explaining a scientific process rather than admitting to one of the greatest intelligence breaches in modern history. After his arrest, the question that haunted investigators was how many others like him were still out there, still passing information, still convinced they were doing the right thing. The Cambridge Five made the Fuchs case look small. Kim Philby, Donald McLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross were recruited as students in the 1930s, all from elite British backgrounds, all placed inside the exact institutions Moscow wanted. Philby rose to a senior role in British intelligence, running anti-Soviet operations while secretly working for the Soviets. McLean handled Foreign Office communications, including U.S. nuclear policy. Burgess used charm and connections to glide through government. Blunt became a royal art expert with high-level access. Cairncross worked at Bletchley Park. All fed Moscow intelligence for years while staying hidden. McLean and Burgess defected to the Soviet Union in 1951 after being tipped off by Philby, who was still working inside British intelligence at the time. Philby himself did not defect until 1963, after 12 more years of providing Moscow with information about Western counterintelligence efforts. Blunt was identified but given immunity in exchange for cooperation, a decision that caused enormous controversy when it became public. Cairncross was only confirmed as the fifth member after archival releases decades later. What made them so dangerous was trust. They were trusted. Other than being skilled at espionage tradecraft, Burgess in particular was reckless and sloppy. Their backgrounds, their education, their social class made them unthinkable as traitors. British intelligence could not imagine that men from their world would betray it, and that blind spot was exactly what Soviet intelligence exploited. Now, if you are wondering how any of this was ever discovered, how intelligence agencies finally figured out who was working for Moscow, you need to understand that it was not dramatic arrests or last-minute chases. Technically, it takes years of grinding, methodical work. Keep watching, because understanding how they were caught tells you as much about espionage as understanding how they operated. Make sure you subscribe, because the next part reveals the invisible systems that eventually brought these networks down. The breakthrough came from two sources. First was the Venona Project, a secret code-breaking effort that began in 1943. American and British analysts struggled to decrypt Soviet cables protected by one-time pads, but Soviet mistakes allowed fragments to be decoded. Code names surfaced, meeting spots appeared, and clues slowly linked to real classified projects. The messages were incomplete, but patterns grew, revealing entire spy networks. The second source was Defectors. KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin spent years copying files before fleeing in 1992. His archive exposed names, dates, and operations worldwide. Together, Venona and Mitrokhin finally exposed the scale of Soviet espionage. What it took to be a Soviet spy was belief, access, and patience to live a double life. The most dangerous ones saw themselves as servants of a higher truth. History has judged them, but the documents remain. Subscribe and comment your thoughts below.